Make up your mind. Make up your mind, Andrew Chandler.
A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. That's a quote from a satirical poem in the 1600s by English poet Samuel Butler. Samuel was essentially trying to tell us, you can't force ideas or points of view on people unless they get there themselves. Oh, for the simplicity of Mr. Butler's world. For today, we're exposed to so many subtle influences, it's quite easy to have our minds half made up for us without us even knowing. So today, my subject is the principles of how we're influenced, be it to do something, buy something, or think something, hidden yet not so secret. It's based on the work of Dr. Chianti, who is a professor at the University of Arizona. And he's done some pioneering work in this area, supported by studies in economics, psychology, and even marketing. And a key premise of Dr. Chianti's research is that in a busy, complex world, we often have to make quick decisions. And we do so by way of judgment heuristics, or as you and I know them, rules of thumb. And most of the time, these rules of thumb work very well for us. But occasionally, they lead to costly mistakes. So I will cover each of the 6 principles Dr. Chianti gave us in the time we have. The first one is reciprocity, the overpowering rule that we have to return favors to each other. When we don't, ultimately that leads to dissatisfaction. Show me a friend who doesn't return any of your favors, and eventually I will show you an ex-friend. In dating, for example, too, particularly in the early days, reciprocity is very important. I remember after a second date once when I picked up the tab, my date said, no problem, I will pick up the third. Well, after the meal of the third date, I excused myself to the washroom to go and wash my hands. I came back, she was not at the table. She was standing outside the restaurant. Fortunately, I checked whether the bill had been paid. Well, it hadn't. So in my view, my date had broken the rule of reciprocity. Maybe it was unrequited. But from there, I think the message was, maybe she didn't want me. Second principle of influence is a likability, often linked to reciprocity. The idea that we're naturally well disposed to people that we know and like, which is easy enough between friends and colleagues, but most pronounced between people that are trying to sell us something. In fact, it's a known principle that people tend to like people who like themselves or are like themselves. And so salesmen spend an inordinate amount of time trying to generate instant similarity and likability with us from the compliments they might give us, trying to establish commonality in the conversation. And even, can you believe, certain cases mirroring our language and actions. Indeed, likability is known as the friendly thief. The third principle in this first triumvirate is commitment and consistency. Now, nobody likes a flick. That's why when any of us make a commitment and try our best to keep it, even if only to preserve our own self-image. Again, salesmen and cold callers, one of which I got today that was so irritating, know this and can get very good at extracting small little commitments out of us, to the point where you get this feeling in your stomach that you can't go back on the commitments that you've already made. Commitment and consistency. First 3 principles, if you think about it, reciprocity, likability, and commitment and consistency, they often work together. And when they do, their impact is even more magnified. Which brings us to principle number 4, authority. That great societal pressure we have to respect experts. Now, I quoted Dr. Chianti in my work today, and probably you thought nothing of it until now. Well, actually, his name is Dr. Chialdini. Chianti is something you can have later. Which gets us to the principle, isn't it, that authority can be faked. And often is. And you have to ask yourself, what does it take to really be an expert? And I would say to you 2 things. One is, the person really has to know what they're doing. And 2 is, they have a vested interest in telling the truth. Now, I don't think it matters which side of the political spectrum you sit tonight. given what's happening on TV these days with all these talking heads, I just wonder how many of these so-called experts are able to pass both of those tests. I would say maybe not as many as we'd like. Principle number 6, scarcity. This is the idea that we're naturally drawn to things that are less available. It has an impact on our behavior. I remember a few years ago, there was a shortage of rice in Asia, I think as a result of climatic conditions. And sacks of rice just started falling off the shelves here. I remember even Costco ran out of it. As if Costco can run out of anything. Salesmen too, starting with car salesmen, particularly can get good at this principle called goosing you off the fence. Help make you a decision. This car might not be here tomorrow. We have limited inventory. I think you know it and you've probably seen it. Principle of scarcity. That gets us to the final principle, social proof, which I think is actually one of the most important, particularly in this day and age. And that's the idea that we often look to others for sources of advice, particularly in times of uncertainty. Maybe you heard the phrase, "Don't drink the Kool-Aid," which comes from Jim Jones, a cult leader here in San Francisco in the 70s, who exerted a lot of control over his followers using exactly this principle and another one, isolation. But I think, for me, probably the most saddest example of this principle was a video I saw after the first building had been hit from 911. And obviously a lot of folk had exited the building, building 2, and chosen to hang around. And that in itself, I think, is as we know, a questionable decision. But what happened was, slowly, people started drifting into the building again, for whatever reason. Either they were given the go-ahead, or they were impatient to get back to their desks. And eventually it became a stream. You know, how sad. Those people just didn't choose to go home that day. So for me, social proof holds a very strong significance. So there you have it, the 6 principles of influence. On the one hand, you have reciprocity, likability, and commitment and consistency. The 3 amigos that like to work together. And then you have authority, scarcity, and social proof. The 3 renegades will make an ass out of you if you let them. Now you know these principles, you can recognize them, smile and congratulate yourself when you do. Just maybe don't let them take you where you wouldn't want to go. Make up your own mind.